reverence is kind of somewhere in that realm of awesome, but participating in awesomeness. And I mean awesome in the dictionary term, not the like cool California, everything is awesome, this avocado toast is awesome. But in the literal way, I see this like expansive nature and I feel that awe. But that's passive, right? And reverence is you're also giving something back. So it's almost a value as it is a feeling in a way.
First, I am going to ask you because I want to say it properly. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name correctly, so I wanted to check with you.
Yeah, so it's Ville
Ville.
Kansanen. Yeah, but
Ville.
it's hard, so people default to Ville, and I'm okay with that mispronunciation. I'm like happy with that. So
I live in Montreal, so at least we're English and French, so some effort should be made to pronounce things like remotely correctly.
For sure, yeah.
Okay. Ville. Maybe I'll just start by introducing you as a multidisciplinary artist.
Sure.
Would that be right?
Yes, that would be exactly right. Yes.
Okay. And so from what I've seen, it's a mix of photography and video, of land and installation art.
Correct. Yeah, it's all of that. I'm doing more installation sculptural work now, but primarily I started out doing photography, and then it's kind of like installation in the context of photography in a way. So it has this bias of being photographed.
So before we even get started on this list of questions,
okay,
maybe just explain what is meant by installation art or land art.
Okay, so helpful difference is that there are sculptures and then there are installations, and sculptures can stand alone anywhere. So they're self-contained art. And installation work is usually specific to where it is. So it has some sort of relationship to where it is. People often use site-specific installation as a kind of shorthand for that. Also, they're not meant to really last. So it's like most of the time an installation piece isn't something you can put in a box and send it to a buyer or something. So it requires installation, literally.
We'll come back to the kinds of pieces that you create. And let me just take a step back then and ask you what first brought you to making art.
I don't think anything really brought me to making art. I used to draw when I was a kid, so I don't really remember any time I didn't have a proclivity to be creative. it was just a given. And I think it was just a given in my family, and everybody else just assumed that's what Ville is going to do. He's going to be an artist of some sort. So there's no specific moment or rational plan. I like to think of it as like I maybe got more serious in my like late teens and early 20s in terms of trying to figure out that I want to make a career out of it, specifically photography. I got at first I was really I just had the side notion that our real artists are just painters, and I still do a little bit. I really wanted to make more realistic and more detailed paintings. It was so hard. I just never could get to that place. And then when I discovered photography, all of a sudden I have access to all this realism. And that's kind of how I got onto that path. So really wanted to make an effort to become a professional artist. So I applied to a couple art schools in Finland. I couldn't get in for a couple of years. And so in between that, we have conscription in Finland. So I went to the military for a year, and for some reason really like kind of enjoyed the structure there. So I stayed and worked for a bit. So I was a drill sergeant for a bit, and finally got into art school in Glasgow in Scotland. So I went there for a year, was really miserable. I got really depressed being there, and I didn't really get along with the teachers very well. There was a kind of gap. The way I grew up, I didn't have no one in my family was an artist or creative at all. So I was the only sort of person. These days, usually you have to kind of have the background in art before you even go to art school. And I was kind of the weird guy who kind of taught himself everything. And I kind of grew up in terms of my artistic life, kind of in the internet at the time. So like there were a lot of communities when I was younger that I don't know, really exist anymore. But, there's places like DeviantArt was like a big deal when I was growing up. And so I would actually meet other artists, and I traveled to France once and to New York once to just meet people that I met online as artists online. And I don't think
Wow.
I don't think kids would do that anymore. So I don't think that's like a thing, because it's like you meet a person on the internet, probably shouldn't go visit. But I really loved it. It was really amazing. So those were kind of my formative experiences. But there was definitely a gap. So I wasn't really sophisticated like the other students were at the fine arts school. And so I definitely felt that the whole time. So I definitely had a lot of like issues trying to fit in, and didn't really feel like I was a part of the group. So I felt really like isolated throughout my whole experience there. And art school is an institution. So regardless of how open an institution is always by default kind of tyrannical. Like it has a program, and if you don't follow the program, you're kind of left outside. Like there's not a lot of recourse if you don't buy into the program that's presented. And I just wasn't very good at that. I was not much of a conformist, so it was hard. The teachers really didn't like me, and it was a hard year.
It's an interesting observation from a former drill sergeant, right? that it's that structure, and then, but I guess at that point, that's not what you wanted for yourself in your formation as an artist. It would be okay as in the army, but not as an artist.
Yeah, exactly. My beef was that they spent a lot more time teaching you how to think than I would have thought. So I didn't like that. To me, I didn't understand why it was their business how I arrived to my ideas, rather than focusing on making those ideas as good as possible. I felt like it was more very structured as to like what kind of things you're supposed to do to arrive. So I don't know. Maybe it was just it in some way I had already spent so many years doing things my own way that I had formulated a way to do that. So maybe most of the students needed the guidance to learn how to think more creatively, or learn how to think in a way that's creating work that's a part of the sort of river of culture where all little tributaries too. So maybe it's that. I don't know. It was a tough year. I had a little flat that was also didn't help, but it was like I really wanted to live alone. So I had this flat that was kind of outside of the school, pretty far away because I couldn't afford it any closer. And I had like at my worst times, I had a bucket of water in the kitchen that I would like scream into, so I wouldn't disturb my neighbors.
Oh goodness, no.
And like I would wake up at really strange times. I would sleep really long periods of time, and I just miss all like classes. I wake up at 4 or 5 p.m. suddenly and not know like where I am. It was I think it kind of damaged me a little bit in some way. It was really like changed me as a person. But it is what it is. And I think the lesson I took from that is that that as hard as it was and as little support I felt I had, I also wasn't really ready, or I definitely needed to do more work to try to understand how contemporary art really works, and how to meaningfully contribute to the larger picture. So I think it helped me, but I had to figure that out on my own, I think, which is fine, but it takes a lot longer and a lot harder to do.
So after 1 year, you said, I've had enough. I'm leaving this program.
Correct. Yeah. And I
Okay.
had a long distance relationship with an American woman, and I just decided to move out to LA. And I was like, well, I'm just going to be an artist and see what happens. And it was a terrible time because it was 2009 and the economy was in a total meltdown. So I was an immigrant, and I couldn't get any work because I didn't have a work background in the US. And then like the immigration system's so bad that it took 8 months to even get a work permit. So I was just doing a lot of like cash only work and things like that, really hustling the whole time. So I did it to myself a little bit, but it was definitely hard to get established in the US.
I bet that hustling was as much a good preparation for your career as that 1 year in art school. Honestly.
Yeah,
better.
Definitely better, I would say. Like you really have to learn how to be okay with a lot of ambiguity in a way, and then go into it with like confidence that you can figure it out. And I think that's like a trait that you don't learn necessarily unless you're doing things. And then I also like learned a lot about how to be professional that, I don't know if that's something art schools really provide, because it is a business at the end of the day. Like we don't want to think of it that way, but being a good artist, having the good skills and having good concepts and being really talented, that's not enough. I don't think that's a great artist. Like a great artist is able to do all that and then also learn how to put the work out there and make the relationships and like kind of hustle. Like that's kind of the definition. Like it's very rare to have a Francis Bacon who is like totally hopeless with other people and still be really successful. I don't know if that's possible anymore. Maybe it is, but it's really rare.
I can't remember where I was reading recently, but it was about that. And it was about the fact that that's not new to art. The Leonardo da Vinci's and all of those guys were constantly in relationships with kings and other people with lots of money who they would have to have help to support their careers. And they were constantly working in collaboration with other people to get their work out and sold and to be supported.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's probably a lot of artists who are a lot better than Leonardo da Vinci that we've just never heard of because they labored alone in some cave somewhere. Like, who knows? Like, it's kind of like that. So it can be unfortunate too, because if I don't necessarily, like, you think about it, like someone like, I don't know, like Andy Warhol is just, he's a good epitome of that. He's on the other side of that. Like it was almost secondary, like what his products were almost secondary to his like ability to market and PR and be that.
That's right.
It's a racket a little bit, I think, art.
Well, life's a racket, really. So why should art be exempt from that, right? It's like most of us are trying to hustle and get stuff done.
That's so true. But it is a little unfortunate because I feel like a lot of artists fall into this trap that they maybe get too focused on creating a product for a market. And I think that leads to a kind of monotonous culture. Like I think a lot of the art that you see these days, it's all kind of in the same themes and same kinds of production in a way, which I don't know if this is just a statement of everybody's beholden to the gallery system in some way. And the institutions like schools really prepare you to do that because that's their metric for success is, representation in art, an art gallery or museums or, getting the work out there. That's what the schools are for. But I feel like it would be great if we had more institutions that support art that isn't in the main, like less in the zeitgeist.
Well, I mean, to go back to what you were saying earlier too, if part of an institution is to teach people how to think, then part of their mandate somehow becomes this is art that's worthwhile producing, and this is art that's not worthwhile producing. And so they start channeling, I'm sure, what kinds of art get made.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a fine line. It's because you have to contribute to moving the world forward. And if you're an artist, that's one of your mandates is to try to contribute and move things forward and provide like a new perspective. But yeah, I feel like I don't know if it's just like during my lifetime or what, but maybe it's just always like that. I don't know, but people are very stuck in certain themes, and it seems hard for them to break out of that. And then I think maybe artists, they look around and they say, well, I have these interests that I really am interested in, but how am I going to live? How am I going to feed myself? And so they default to certain themes, it seems like.
So why don't we use that as kind of a step into themes that you explore through your work, and maybe use an example of a piece that you've done recently as and how that exemplifies that theme?
Let's see. It's hard to pick just one. I recently put out a book last year, and the central theme of the book is this idea of what is the origin of religious states of mind? What is the origin of those states of mind that then give birth to, religions and structures of spirituality in a way? So I've been very interested in that, and the book is called Numen, and I don't know if you know, like numinous is usually the word you hear more often. It's just something or place that's imbued with that spiritual divine power. And and it had a noun, it was Newman, and I think, okay, well, I might use that. And it's hard to name things in a way that's like hasn't been used by some 2-bit startup tech company or a building. Like, it's very difficult to find names like that word.
It's a good one. It's a beautiful word. It's a beautiful word. I didn't know what it meant because I saw it on your website. I'm like, I don't know what that means, but the pictures are beautiful. The word is beautiful.
Yeah, it is a beautiful word. It's a beautiful idea, because I think we've already, I don't know, like we've all had experiences like that, I think, where like I've had specific, I think maybe it's a little bit of a cliche or not, but I had the good fortune when I visited Rome when I was young. And for some reason, the Sistine Chapel wasn't as busy as it usually is, because it's usually pretty packed. And there was only a few people, and I walked in there, and it was just, I'd never seen anything like that. And it was just the epitome of what I felt like the epitome of what an artist can achieve in a way. And that felt like a place it was a very numinous place, And so I think there are places like that, but I think nature provides the most numinous places, I would say, because you can't really, artists are just always trying to create some second-rate version of what nature can do. But, back to your question. So a lot of the work revolves around this kind of mimicry of world creation in a way. So I've always worked in the desert, but I used to do self-portraits only. That's kind of how I started. And I use the desert as a kind of space, and more like as a metaphysical kind of, like in the surrealist tradition, like a substitute for the expansive human mind, kind of, in that way. And the more time I spent there, I realized that there's just a lot going on in the desert that people don't realize. The desert isn't a static place really at all. Like, it changes quite a bit. And there's like all kinds of really interesting life and minerals and rocks, and the changes in light and everything else. And so I have very short attention span that used to, like, I couldn't really like stay with one thing for very long. So I just decided that I'm going to slow down my practice so much that I'm going to be forced to notice and be excited by smaller incremental things, because it's hard. You start feeling a little bit constricted. I feel like after a while, as an artist, you get to this arc that at first everything's new and you're kind of like, everything's exciting and you're constantly learning. And every time you're doing something, you get this kind of rush from, oh, I was able to do this thing, or this thing happened, and I'm really excited by the effect or result. And at some point you get to a kind of fulcrum where you just have to start appreciating smaller incremental, I guess, points of excitement in a way. Like, something happens and it's not going to blow your mind, but you're kind of working at little things. So your skill set is much more sophisticated, and you're able to create much, I guess, quote unquote, better results. And so the leaps and bounds become shorter. So I spent 7 years working on the book, and it was really just trying to create a more meaningful relationship with nature, but in the desert. And the desert's a great place to do that because, it's the birthplace of monotheism. It has that sort of singular power to it. And it's very unrelenting. And it has a tension, because you kind of feel like you might die every time you're there. You could, like, it happens all the time. People get lost and their car breaks down or whatever. They don't have enough water. So there's definitely that electrical sort of feeling to it. so I would use rocks and sand, and kind of I tried my best to mimic every natural event there. So whether it was how a mountain is made, or how does land form, or how are clouds made, that kind of became the central thesis for the work.
So if the idea was how religions come to be, the mindset, was that it? The mindset from which religions come?
Yeah.
And then how do you relate that to nature and what you were just describing around mountains are created? Is it like mountain as an example of these are the kinds of things that evolve from a kind of, I was going to say barren landscape, but it's not barren because you were saying that there's so much going on in the desert, but it seems empty. So is it the desert is sort of the place representing the mind, and then what emerges from that space?
No, so yeah, so I think just to
dumb it down for me, Ville. Dumb it down for me,
I'm not.
No, please.
But like the separation was that I used to think of the desert as a place for the mind, and I quit doing that. The assumption is that the first human religious structures were pretty animistic. So the nature was really supernatural. It wasn't natural. And so the idea was that with the ability that photography has, and I think art in some ways, but photography specifically has, to create and extend time and space, and to imbue it with that numinous power that's not really possible in normal life. So the idea was that I'd create these encounters with nature that feel supernatural in a photograph to elicit that original sort of state of mind, right? Because an ancient human sees lightning and they think that's a god doing things. That most likely, what else could it be? Because you don't really have a conception of what electricity is. It's just every event is just meaningful in that way, and we don't have that access. So I thought, why don't I try to elicit that same state of mind through photography? So make the supernatural explicit in a way by using the photographic space as a substitute place for that animistic past.
Okay, so this was one of the things about installation art, sort of in general for me, and land-based art, is it's super conceptual. Like I'm not very familiar with it. So as opposed to a drawing of a human being that that's quite accessible to me. But I feel like installation art, for example, is like way at the opposite end of the spectrum from that, where maybe you just have to make yourself super open to it. I might try to understand it too hard. I'm trying to figure, what is that artist trying to get at? And why is it like this? And try to think my way through it, as opposed to just saying, because that whole idea of the numinous thing that's a feeling, right? That's just like, you want some kind of emotional response, not a thoughtful one.
Yes, exactly. I definitely, I never call my work conceptual, but I understand why you would say that. I think I provide it for those people who want me to provide it. For me, it's like my reaction or gratification exactly the same when a person goes, wow, I felt really, that just looks so interesting, or that's really beautiful, or I get some emotion as to like, well, this like concept of the numinous is really interesting. Or like I write essays and there's a long essay in the back of the book, and some people really want to have a conversation about the essay and how it relates to the work. And I don't really care. Either one is great. I don't want to create for some narrow audience that it really enjoys conceptual art. I think it has to be true for me is I enjoy that. It won't get me up from bed and be excited by the idea unless it is based on something. And also you'll just be making pretty things. Again, that's not really something I care about. As far as I'm a conceptual artist, I'm a conceptual artist for myself in some way. And I do find that people want, at the end of the day, they want some sort of explanation. And I hope that the explanation that I provide enforces their reaction to it, or it makes it deeper in a way. So it's there, but it's also there. I think the work has to stand alone, as kind of aesthetically and emotionally. Otherwise, it's not a very good work. And a lot of installation art isn't doing that. You go to like the MoMA, or you go to wherever you go to see an installation piece. A lot of the times it's kind of like what I would call visual philosophy. I don't think you can understand it without the long artist statement. Maybe it's just very heretical of me to say, but sometimes I have a very pedestrian reaction to it, in a way where I go to God, I'm like, well, this just kind of looks like a heap of stuff, and I don't like it. Like, I don't love it. And then I go and I read the statement. I'm like, okay, well, now I rationally understand why the heap of stuff is here, but I can't say I feel much. Like, it's an interesting idea, and thinking is fun for me, but I don't have a visceral like reaction. I don't think it elevates my like human experience very much.
That was the word that I was going to go for, as far as like there's a conceptual component and there's a visceral component, and not even weighting them one relative to the other. But I think I missed that when we first were starting to talk about, because the idea of the Newman is a very emotional, visceral response to something that you've witnessed.
Yeah, exactly. I'm really interested in like phenomenology, like the philosophy of phenomenology, right? And I think it was Heidegger who said, like, you lose the access of being as soon as immediately you start thinking about it, because the thought isn't like, that's it. Like, you can't. So that's why philosophy can't do it for you. Like, philosophy can explain where it is, like, broadly, but as to what it is, no words can explain, because being is being, and that's it. So it's I think of it as the same way. Like, there's that realm, like the spiritual realm, and it is, and there's no point in debating it in a sort of rational way. Like, it's just a pointless exercise.
Yeah, you've almost literally put your finger, I think, on the struggle of my life.
Oh, really?
And I grew up in a very rationalist tradition, and I studied the rationalist philosophers, and I stopped before Heidegger and Husserl and those guys, because like, I don't get that stuff. I don't understand what it means to like feel it. I don't get it. So I think I stopped at Wittgenstein, who kind of was moving, he was like moving from the super logical positivist tradition into a more open. I could go as far as him, but then I had to stop. But I feel like the rest of my life is a journey, so I was struggling to find my way into the visceral experience of life.
That's exactly what the series was about for me, because I'm a super rational person. I think a lot of creative people are, if they can't be creative, they become like obsessively rational. At least I am. And it's kind of a terrible way to live. I think you lose the human experience in a lot of ways. It's not even, I don't think, necessarily a good way to organize human activity at the end of the day. Everything is a utilitarian decision in some ways. And then everything is an explanation. And that's not what human beings are about. Like the same thing, you go to this museum and you see conceptual art, and like humans don't exist in the conceptual plane. We think our thoughts may, and our dialogue may, but at the end of the day, all of our core meaningful experiences have nothing to do with rationality. I guess my reaction to just growing up, Finland is a very sort of, everybody's an engineer kind of, it's kind of known for that. And so everything's very rational. Although the people I grew up with, it was kind of taboo to be a spiritual person. That's like for those like weird people in California or something. Like, that's not really, you can't take those people serious. It's all kind of woo and crystals. And I just felt like that was wrong in some way. I was always so envious of people who were religious. Now, I don't particularly think that organized religion is very productive for an individual. Organizing it makes it kind of cold. So I'm not a fan of religions per se, but I am a fan of whatever experience those people have when they believe in something and have faith in something. I never had that. And I'm not sure I still have it. I have a little bit more of it, but that envy really drew me to make the kind of work I do now. Is I really want to get to that place. A way for me to be able to do that is to kind of return to first principles. So I thought, where does this feeling come from before all the layers of human thought and constructs? Like, what is that? What is that feeling, because no one's going to provide it for me. I'm not going to go to a church. It's like everything's obfuscated by these like old rituals who you just do it a certain way because you do it a certain way. There's nobody really has access to the old sort of meditation practices of Christianity, for example.
If I could like paraphrase, if I'm going to try to distill,
Yeah.
then in a way, sort of organized religion is like a rationalization of the spiritual or the numinous. In a way, it takes the life out of it by structuring it and makes rules and traditions and things that we have to observe, and we lose the essence of the feeling behind it. And the work that you do is a way of approaching the same phenomenon, but rather than from the structured, conceptual, maybe overly organized thing, you come at it from an emotional, nature-based experience, emotional, visceral, like allowing us to have those experiences where everyday life, in fact, there aren't that many opportunities for us to have those experiences anymore naturally.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I think the structures and rituals and routines themselves have become the religion rather than what the real basis was. At least that's how I always felt.
Okay, so if we like one of the directions my head started going off in at the end of that, the tail end of that was, so one of the reasons maybe that we impose structures and traditions and practices and things is to reduce the risk, right? So we kind of like put stuff in a box to make it safe because that's a controlled way of leading lots and lots of people through a certain kind of experience. And then the opposite is to allow it to be open and there's greater risk. And of course, I'm trying to tie it into vulnerability, right? So I can sort of see this sort of thread to that. So how do you think about the idea or the experience of, I should say, vulnerability and where that might play in your work and what we've been talking about?
I guess I would turn the question and I guess ask you like what to define the term a little bit. Like, what do you mean when you say that? Because I think it means certain things to certain people.
What are you doing turning the tables on me, Ville? Like, come on. That's not how it works. Didn't I instruct you properly at the beginning?
Sorry. But I'm curious because I'm really, because you have a whole, I listened to a few episodes and trying to prepare a little bit. And you've made it such a central theme to your own work. And so I just, I feel like you probably have a much better definition than I could ever come up with. So I'm just curious.
I have not made as much progress in my understanding as I might have thought at this point on episode 60, whatever, unfortunately. But I think what has evolved from, I think, sort of like an everyday understanding of vulnerability as the risk of being hurt. So it's a bad thing. You don't want to be vulnerable. You want to be strong. You want to protect yourself from the risk of being hurt by something either outside of you or inside of you. I think that's a little bit interesting too. So what are the things within you that you protect yourself from? So, but that comes from that idea of vulnerability is, having to protect yourself from harm. And then I think it is sort of evolving for me more into the idea of it's an openness without which we can't grow. Mm-hmm. So you have to allow things in from outside, and you have to acknowledge things that are within you that you might not always want to look at, and take a risk that it might hurt, and acknowledge that sometimes it really does. It hurts. And that part of today's culture is so much about, we want to be happy. We want to be strong. It's not okay to, not even that it's not okay to cry, but we're always should be striving for getting past that. It's not, that's okay. That's part of, life happens, but we should try always to be positive and to be happy and to be strong. And at the risk of, I'm not suggesting that we wallow in our vulnerabilities.
That's weakness, right?
That's weakness, right? Yeah. So how do we approach vulnerability with strength? How do we go through vulnerable experiences for growth? I guess recognizing there's no other way. You are not going to grow in any other way than it, unless you break yourself open and make yourself, not make yourself. not going to think of the right word, but use those experiences to grow, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think of that?
That's great. I think that's a very hard, that's always been a very hard thing for me. I think my general disposition is always to try to be like perfect for every situation. So I'm always living in fear of being found out about something kind of a little bit. So I always feel that way. Maybe that's just, things happen in their life. Certainly in art, I think that's kind of, probably informed by my experience in art school and elsewhere, where I always feel like I'm definitely in some type of imposter. So I'm working really hard not to get caught for my stupid mistakes and my confusing ideas. So I would say that's very difficult. That's very difficult for me. In some ways, the self-portrait work was very much kind of like that. It was very, I guess, doing the work is one thing, but then, if you're an artist, you have to show it to other people and you have to get a feedback. And that's a really horrible, kind of vulnerable place to be in. At least for me, it was. And I couldn't really separate who I was personally from, the artwork itself. Because, you might get a critique or whatever. And it felt like a critique of who I am and what I think and everything else. And so that was really hard. So I think in some ways, maybe I also decided to change the way I work to avoid some of that. So maybe it became a little less vulnerable. I don't know. I would say, in the work itself, maybe the vulnerability comes through in the manner in which a lot of the installations are made, because they're all very fragile and broken in a lot of ways. They look like they're about to fall apart. And I have series like that where, for example, I had this series of, I dug up this little square of sand or from the desert, and I put it on this kind of like an altar piece, and then I would go away for like a year or whatever, and I'd come back and take a photograph of it, and it kind of changed and it became a part of this altar piece. And then I would again remove the soil and put it up again, and I would do that until the sand disappeared. The idea being there that you're always trying to piece yourself together from broken bits and pieces, and it's kind of a desperate endeavor to try to do that. And I think at least my life has always been a little bit like that, where there's a kind of fragility, and you're always find yourself in that place where your life and physics breaks you apart a little bit, and then you want to try to reformulate yourself in the best possible way, but it's always a little bit eroded in some way or another. And I think a lot of my practice is just trying to accept that that's going to happen. There's no perfect end result there. And the whole process is just you disappear kind of at the end of the day. That's what happens.
So that piece is a kind of a self-portrait in a way. Yeah. So maybe some of the work that you're doing now, at least, continue to be self-portraits. What else might be similar across in terms of the themes? Or
I think it's just my sort of general despair for the society I find myself in, I guess. Our attention spans are terrible. We value things that I don't think are particularly meaningful, and we don't take the time to have any deep experiences. And then at the end of the day, I don't think we even realize it. And that kind of feels really desperate to me. I think it's just my humble way of trying to get people to slow down a little bit and maybe think about those more really primordial things about human existence and human life that we've layered ourselves away from.
I love what you just shared. I have to be totally honest with you. Yes, we don't take the time, and we're not deeply engaged with what we, much anymore. But I actually got a little verklempt when you said and we don't even know it. Like, that is the saddest part of the whole thing, is to not even recognize that that's who we're becoming in our lives. It's actually devastating. God,
It is.
I'm like tearing up a little bit.
Yeah, it really is. And I think maybe a vulnerability is that I try to do that, and I know it's not going to work at the end of the day.
Thank you so much, Ville, and enjoy a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.